Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Weiss, co-chair of Steptoe's International Trade Policy Practice and lead of the firm's supply chain team. Welcome to Supply Chain University, where we dive into the legal, policy, and advocacy issues surrounding supply chains. To find out more, visit our website at steptoe.com. On this episode, we are talking with two guests, a very exciting episode. First, we have Charlie Clark, CEO of Darkbeam, and thanks so much for joining us, Charlie.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
And I'm also joined by my partner at Steptoe, Charles Helleputte, who heads the EU cybersecurity data and privacy practices here at Steptoe. So welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Jeff. Glad to be here.
And the subject of today's discussion is ransomware threats to the supply chain. So it's going to be a very exciting episode. Maybe we can start with you, Charlie. Maybe you can tell our viewers a little bit about your background and about Darkbeam.
Well, thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks, Steptoe. Guys, I'm an ex-soldier for a number of years. I was then a banker for 14 years, and then I founded a company called Roslyn Data Technologies, which I IPO'd, and Roslyn became a foremost provider of supply chain analytics in sort of the Northern Hemisphere. When I was doing that, I was undertaking a number of digital transformation programs with some of the great and the good. And it was during those exciting times that I saw an opportunity to focus more of my time on digital risk within the supply chain. And as so many of you know, when the internet was founded not that long ago, the last thing anybody thought about when they were inventing it was security. So there's a super opportunity to be more secure in this great new digitally connected world, and that's my background. And what Darkbeam does, it now supports lots and lots of clients monitor and measure the digital risk of the suppliers within their supply chain at speed and scale.
Great. Thanks so much again for joining us, Charlie. Charles, can you tell us a little bit about your background with cybersecurity and about the practice here at Steptoe?
Yeah, sure. Happy to, Jeff. So, so basically, I joined Steptoe to found the EU cyber data and privacy practice here at the firm. It's a kind of a bit of a war story for me as well, why I'm doing cyber. So, a long time ago, I identified that cyber is going to be, or likely to going to be a big thing with the EU starting to regulate the sector. And so I joined lots of meetings with the EU agencies where I was the only lawyer in the room. And since then, there is much of us in those meetings because everyone realized that there is a legal aspects to cyber that I'm happy.
Just a little one.
Just a little one.
So,
exactly.
So with that as the basis, why don't we start? So why don't we start by talking about, what is supply chain digital risk, and is that different from other risks, and why? And maybe Charlie, we can start with you.
Well, Jeffrey, my goodness, what a time to be talking about this. I don't know whether you've been reading in the newspapers what a terrible time the UK is having at the moment with its supply chain. My wife yesterday spent most of the afternoon trying to find some gas and petrol for her car, and I was in a restaurant which had half of the menu struck off because of what's happening in the supply chain. So I think most of us have been so lucky to take the supply chain for granted, and we don't know much about it, and it's becoming very, very real today, certainly here, and I think, Charles, certain parts of Europe are going through the same issues, is how much we rely on it. But what's digital risk in the supply chain? And I think the word digital is the key component here. And it is a subsegment, it's a segment of the integrated supply chain risk matrix that all of our large customers and clients have to manage. So they've got environmental, social, governance, financial, all of those risks, and digital risk sits now very, very firmly in that integrated risk management process. And what it is in reality is that for the last 100 years or so, we've had we've looked at risk as a function of land, sea, and to a certain degree air, and in the last 20 years space. And our insurance companies and the way that we've managed risks internally has been bounded by those four very clearly defined and well understood risk characteristics. There's law, there's boundaries, they're all physical, and there's ways of how we exploit those wonderful resources. Well, like in any great drama, there is a petulant teenager, and along comes cyber, and there are no laws, there are no rules, and it is global, and the barriers to entry are very low. And if we look at cyber, it's always on, unlike any of the other risks that we're used to, and it can be, if it's not controlled, quite damaging to a market that is now completely connected. Now, I don't know whether Charles heard Ursula von der Leyen 2 days ago in the chamber, or 3 days ago in the chamber, Charles, when she said, if everything is connected, everything can be hacked. And I think that's really important now as a business, that this risk is very different in the fact that it's criminal. You know, we can look at all of those other areas which can be affected by geopolitical stuff, weather, financial. It's very defined. This is based on criminal activity, and it therefore it is very difficult to control. If you look at the three cyber superpowers, the US, China, and Russia, the likelihood of those three parties getting round a table and creating the rules and regulations of the internet and the cyberspace are as likely, I'm more likely to have dinner tonight on the moon. It is just not going to happen. So what have governments done? What have countries done? They've pushed down the responsibility of managing this risk into the companies themselves, because there is no defining, overarching umbrella that enables the companies and the citizens within those companies to manage this risk. So it's become very much a corporate responsibility, and that, I think, is quite profound, and puts a huge amount of responsibility on those of us, everybody on this call running companies. I don't know whether Charles wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Charles. I think so. I fully agree with what you just mentioned, and also what I think it's like you are alluding to it, but I think it's important to put that bluntly. The type of enemies you have are of a great variety, because you put the responsibility on companies that have to fight against either gangs or really people that are deploying ransomware just to make money, but also against gangs that are backed by state actors, where really the nature of the harm is very different, and our clients are just one little piece there in a much broader game, which makes probably them even more vulnerable than in other faced to other type of risk. And exactly echoing to your to the trend you described, similarly on the EU side, we have seen really a development of the regulatory framework around preparation for cyber resilience and cybersecurity, with the EU doing what is doing best, which is regulate. First, in a narrow way, so by only focusing on critical infrastructure, a number of well-defined sectors, and only for those limiting themselves to the highest or the most risky part of it, so to well-defined actors within those identified sectors. And now we are already one step further, because the new regs that are coming are really spreading the responsibility of compliance with those rules more broadly. So more sector-ins and more companies that will have to cope directly with the rules, rather than being largely or impacted by the rules through contract they have with those entities that were before in scope.
Thanks, Charles. And Charlie, just going back to your point about the likelihood of the U.S., China, and Russia agreeing on cybersecurity, that caused me to have a flashback because when I was in the U.S. government, at one point I drew the short straw, and I had to be the digital economy negotiator in the G20. In 2016, China was the host, and so we had 3 months to agree on cybersecurity as well as privacy and data flows text with China and Russia. And I remember that discussion very vividly. And one of the reasons why is because we could not agree on the word cybersecurity because China and Russia objected to it. They said they didn't know what it meant because they prefer a different term, ICT security. So I take your point on that if we can't even agree on the basic terminology, we're going to have trouble with some more advanced concepts. But I guess going back to your other point, one of the other points you made about if everything's connected, everything can be hacked, which is a comment that you referenced earlier. So what risks do suppliers pose to companies in the supply chain?
So I'm a great believer, and I'm trying to dilute when we engage our customers. I'm trying to dilute the idea of risk, and I'm trying to increase the idea of opportunity. And I think cyber risk. Let me just go for. In order for us to manage this risk, which we are talking about today, I think slowly but surely it's going to move into more of a compliance and governance mandate. As opposed to a risk, which is a cyber risk, which sits very firmly in the IT departments within our companies. Because as we all know, the weakest link in every company are the 3 or 4 people on this call. It's the human being at the other end of an email who opens it. That's the weak link. So I think it'll fall more into compliance governance. So what are the risks that they pose? I think there's 2 dimensions to it, and for those that are not techies on the line today, is that if you can imagine every company a bit like a castle which is under siege, and the knights within that castle will build the walls very as strongly as they possibly can. They will man the ramparts, and they will do whatever they can to defend that castle from the hostage, those guys that are holding them hostage. But as we all know, when we look at those old films, those castles always find a way of getting their water and their food in to that castle at the dead of night, whether it be by the back door, through a sea entrance, or whatever it is. And in many ways, that's how a castle can sort of survive a siege. The minute that castle stops getting water and food in, that the hostage takers can seize control of it without firing an arrow. And that is the image of the sort of the company today in the cyber world. We've got this persistent attack going on from multiple different angles. And what we need to do is we need to find a way of making sure that the raw materials that we require to make what we're making, the services like what Steptoe are providing, are being exchanged safely within those digital channels that we set up. And it's when those channels are compromised that particular company can come then under a threat, and malware can get in, or whatever it may be, can get in and start encrypting all of that data and that IP and bringing that company to its knees. Now that's what I call a targeted attack. Now that will, if it's my company, all of those clients of mine will then be affected, and my services will start going down, and it's what I call the ripple effect starts. Now, depending on what company you are, the ripple effect could be a pebble dropping into a pond, or it could be a bloody great boulder dropping into a pond, and it's quite profound. So now the other type of attack is when a bad actor will gain access either to a website or whatever it is of the supplier, and will inject some malicious code either into a piece of software like in SolarWinds or whatever it is, and the whole and a huge number, hundreds of thousands of folks will want to update their software or whatever it is, and they will download this patch which has got this malicious code injected in it, and therefore the supplier in that case is a bit like a carrier for the bad actor of that malware. And I more recently saw, and therefore you have that's a sort of a boulder effect where it's viral. As one person downloads that software, another person will, and the knock-on effect is not one supply chain, which it is in Colonial, it is multiple supply chains across the world in many cases. And then I think you've got the state actor. It's often called APT for those of you guys that know, will simply sit in a company and just suck all its IP out. They won't make themselves known. It's all in stealth, and it is espionage. And more recently, and pretty sadly, I saw one company that made using 3D printing blades for a drone, and the hackers got in, changed the angles on the blades that were being made, and made the drones totally ineffectual, and they had to go back and replace all the drones. Now, if you can imagine that, thank God it was a drone. If you can imagine that as in a jet or in a fuel pump or whatever it is, it becomes quite profound. So those are 2 to 3 different vectors of attack which can bring a company to a standstill, and then that ripple effect goes across either a single supply chain or can infect multiple supply chains and companies and people.
Thanks, Charlie. You mentioned Colonial. That brings me, I guess, to the next question: is what examples do you have of other companies suffering from cyber attacks through their supply chain, and could they have prevented them?
My goodness, I'm certainly not going to get into a legal debate as to whether they could have prevented them, because I'll have to employ your defense lawyers on my payroll. But I think it's if I take some of the early ones, which I found, what sort of got my teeth into the subject. If you look at the likes of Target, which was a number of years ago now, 2 or 3 years ago, where an HVAC air conditioning supplier to one of the Target depots was breached by a bad actor, and that air conditioning HVAC supplier, I believe this is where the virus, in fact, in this case it was a worm, what we call laterally traversed from the supplier into Target was through an invoice system when they connected to Target's invoicing system, or a system similar to that. I might have the exact details slightly incorrectly, but it was when they connected to Target.
Right.
That bad actor was able to traverse laterally across into Target, and then over many, many, many weeks and months, the bad actors of the patience of saints very carefully moved around Target and got themselves into the EPOS terminal on all of the shops in Target's real estate. And then on Black Friday, when the sales started in Target, they skimmed all of the credit card numbers and details that was going through it, and they stole a lot of money. So that is one of the sort of the earlier well documented supply chain hacks that still happen to this day. However, our IT teams and the software that we're using are becoming much more aware of how to defend ourselves from those things. SolarWinds is incredibly sophisticated, and that was the bad actors went in, injected some code into an update, which was then released into the SolarWinds community, and everybody who was looking to update that program, a SolarWinds application, downloaded the update, and infected their systems. And I think it is that viral nature of how the cyber risk can impact not just a company and not just a supply chain, but a whole industry. So, that is where it is very different. And that industry, if let's just say it's the education industry or it's the defense industry, we are so interconnected. It's not just America or Europe or Germany or whatever it is that gets infected. Because we all use the same systems and because we're all connected, it becomes, fairly wide, it becomes a fairly big global problem fairly quickly. And I think going back to what we were saying earlier on about, America, China, and Russia sitting around the table, I think Biden is one of the first presidents to sort of say, okay, this is a problem, we can't deal with it, but there are rules of engagement. And I think it's a bit like when we were growing up in the Cold War, there were certain things that Russia and the West did that were sort of within the rules of that particular situation. And it wouldn't surprise me that we get to that sort of state quite quickly, because the impact of something going wrong at that scale, as you and I know, when we were growing up and reading the newspapers, can be quite profound. So I think we're going to start seeing, I think you'll be called back, Jeff, to the White House and told to sharpen your pencil again and start defining what cyber is to the Chinese. But so those are some basic examples of how the supply chain can be materially affected through different vectors.
Yeah, and I think what's all of those cases show as well, to your point, Charlie, is that it's visible. So actually, when something is happening, the consequences are there and they are big. And it's very different than back in the days where you had ransomware for small amounts to Mr. or Mrs. Nobody, just to taking out a couple of thousands of euro or dollars. The game has changed, and now you can really see the consequence of those supply chain interlinks, frankly. The fact that all of those CEOs are then called up to testify in Congress or across different of their peers makes also that risk a company risk that everyone should be looking after, probably. And I agree as well with your rule of engagement piece, and I really wonder what will be the rule of engagement on ransomware payment, for example, because as we know, even if no one will openly say so, most of the law enforcement authorities will still tell you you shouldn't pay, but and all of the rules are getting tighter and tighter on ransomware payment. But if I was to be the CEO of Colonial, and I see that nothing will happen unless I'm paying that ransom out there, maybe what I should do is pay even if the world tell me I shouldn't. So I think that there will be a lot of debate going on there on what is the right approach to managing that type of risk, frankly.
Charles, I completely agree with you, and I had quite a heated argument with a barrister, a very well-known barrister in the United Kingdom, who I think, Jeffrey, I introduced you to the other day. And she was saying it's absolutely illegal, you shouldn't pay ransomware, you'll be in court if you do. And I said, I just think it's quite short-sighted. I know the law, and I've got to be careful what I say now. I know the law can be quite black and white, but if you are a small to medium-sized company and you're being asked for $500 or 0.000 of a Bitcoin to release your data so you can run your dentist or you can run your medical practice, I personally would support the doctor or whoever it is paying that $500, because the impact of it of not doing it is far greater than the $500. So I think you're absolutely right. And it goes back to what I was saying. You know, I was in the army, and I served in a place called Northern Ireland. And it was many years ago when it was, you know, very, very interesting, dynamic place. And you would have, you know, 4 masked men go into a house in Belfast, take hostage the whole family, and they would instruct the husband or the father of the family to get in a car and take, let's just say, some guns across Belfast. And if he didn't do it, then the children would be hurt, or the wife would be hurt. Now, which husband or which, you know, wouldn't do that to protect the family? So I think we have to be very careful when the law is written and the law is struck, because you can't victimize and, you know, the victim, you know, blame the victim for doing something if they're trying to protect something else, their livelihood. And the other thing is, and I think I was talking to Jeffrey about this the other day, and you, Charles, was that if I do pay a ransom in this country, potentially I could be breaking a law in America, because the actors who I am paying a ransom to are considered terrorists by the CIA in America and on a blacklist, but they're not on a blacklist in this country. So we have huge legal minefield to navigate.
So, you know, given all these you know, difficult scenarios, I mean, what can we do, and what should we do operationally to try to address these risks?
So I've been thinking about this. I'm working with the insurance industry a lot, because I think, like a lot of things, I was just mentioning land, space, air, and the likes. And I think the insurance industry is going to play a very, very big role going forward. And it's been moving, what we've been doing has been moving so quickly, there's a certain amount of catch up to do. So operationally, it's absolutely vital that the companies, if they are going to be responsible for the security of the data, and it's going to be very difficult to do it, like the other risk characteristics, I think that we are going to get to a place, which I think we're getting to very, very quickly, which is being called a zero trust environment. So, and zero trust means something horrible. I mean, you know, if you're not in the tech world, zero trust means, oh my God, I'm going to go around the world never trusting anybody. It really is not that, but it's a technical term where you do not necessarily take for granted that when you're connecting to a supplier, when you're connecting to a third party, that you should trust them because you've worked with them for the last 10 years. So digitally, they have to prove to you that they meet the standards that you yourselves internally are imposing on yourselves. And that zero trust environment will I think make a big step forward, not the total, it won't take you down the total journey, but make a big step forward towards us closing the gaps and becoming more resilient in our supply chains if we do adopt that. And that means, you know, operationally having all the right compliance and governance in order, using the right, investing quite a lot of money in cyber and technical and governance teams, and also training businesses that are probably quite established. You don't have to be more than 20 years old, really, or 30 years old, to remember the business that you were in didn't have a website. So there's still a huge number of us that started business without the internet, and we do really need to be made much more aware of how we use this fantastic resource safely. So it's a bit like driving a car. I'm sure when Henry Ford's the first car left his factory in Detroit, there wasn't a driving license. Now we all have to when we get into our cars, we need a driving license. We need to understand and to respect the law of the land when we're driving that car, and to show a certain amount of proficiency when driving it. And I think, although we can't make it legal, I think as a company, we have a duty to the great people that we employ to just keep them ahead of the curve and to keep them trained so that when they are using the internet, they're doing so safely.
Yeah, and in addition, regulation is catching up as well, and will really mandate you to do things, and maybe that's the hard way, and it's an unpleasant way, but I think it helps probably everyone realizing that it's really time to do things, not in isolation, but really looking at all of your supply chain all across, because you need, for example, to share trade information across the supply chain to be able to better be aware of what is happening and better response. You need to not only do tabletop exercise for yourself, but also with your major suppliers, because as you mentioned, Charlie, you will face risk or hurdles in your supply chain. At what point it can be directly from you, but it can be because of someone else. So if you never train, let's say, the response that you will be having ahead of time, then by the time it's happening, it's probably too late. And then to your point as well, insurance and sanctions, let's say. So insurance, I think we are currently living in a fascinating world for insurance and cyber risk. We see various positions being taken there on whether or not insurance company will continue to develop coverage there and what will happen. I think they realize that the market grew a lot, but that the level of risk also grew like simultaneously, and making the maths there sometimes a bit complicated. And everyone will also need to be really do it very cautiously, looking at to whom am I eventually paying a ransom to exactly capture what you mentioned, which is, am I breaking one law, two laws, three laws while doing so? And taking that decision, let's say, more educated, let's say, than before, because the consequences might just be tough for everyone.
Thanks, Charles. Charlie, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think all I would say is that we when we look at risk, whether I was managing money in the city or anything like that in a portfolio, you have to look at it in its totality. I think for many years we've looked at digital risk. Who are our critical suppliers in our supply chain? Let's make sure that they are safe. I actually think they are safe. I think those wonderful companies that have been very successful have invested tons of money in security and are doing very well. It's the smaller companies that have imported cheap hardware, that are trying to that live hand to mouth, that cannot afford to update their security every so often, and because of the automated nature that these bad actors work, it's very easy to get into them, and then the bad actor uses the trust that small company has with a big company to laterally traverse into that big company. So don't look at it as necessarily through a prism where the critical ones are the most important. They all are important, and I think you've got to look at your whole supply chain, constantly to remain. When you go into your boardroom, you can say, we have things covered. Don't have any blind spots.
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, I think that's the message loud and clear from this discussion from both of you, the importance of knowing your supply chain and potentially the vector of going in through a small company to get to the larger company. Charles, I think one of the words you used was fascinating, and I think this has been a fascinating discussion, very, very topical as well for companies, for governments, and I think for the public at large. So thank you both for coming on. Really appreciate it, and looking forward to continuing the discussion as this issue develops.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thanks, Charles.
So, Yeah, great to have you. So that's it for this edition of Supply Chain University. You can find this and all of our videos at steptoe.com. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.